Let me take you back to a summer evening, July 30th, 2008. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of diesel and dry grass along the Trans-Canada Highway. There was a young man, a boy really, named Tim McLean. He was small, slight of frame, with a smile that could light up the midway of a carnival, which is exactly where he had been. At just 22 years old, Tim was a creature of the open road himself, a carnival barker, a free spirit who had spent his days amid the bright lights, the grease paint, and the laughter of families looking for joy. He was coming from Edmonton, heading home to Winnipeg, back to the embrace of a family who loved him fiercely. He wasn't a fighter. He was a lover, a chatterbox, a young man with his whole life unspooling before him like a golden thread. He boarded Greyhound Bus 1170, a massive silver beast prowling through the twilight. He found his spot in the back, that cavernous rear section of the bus where the engine's heat rises through the floor and the world feels a little more private. He was wearing his headphones, perhaps losing himself in music, letting the lyrics wash over the exhaustion of his labor. He texted his father, letting him know he was coming home. Just a simple message, electronic pulses sent through the air, the modern equivalent of a wave from a departing ship. He was safe. He was on a schedule. He was just another passenger in a row of weary travelers, everyone locked in their own little bubbles of existence. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, Tim adjusted his pillow against the cool glass of the window. The bus was crowded, filled with the breathing of dozens of souls, but Tim had carved out his own little corner of peace. He curled up, his knees pulled slightly in, making himself small, as we do when we want to disappear into sleep. He closed his eyes. He let his guard down. Why wouldn't he? He was surrounded by ordinary people, students, workers, grandmothers. There was no monster under the bed here, only the steady, comforting vibration of the tires eating up the miles. But darkness, you see, doesn't always announce itself with thunder or a sudden drop in temperature. Sometimes darkness buys a ticket. Sometimes darkness carries a plastic bag and wears sunglasses even when the sun has gone down. As Tim drifted off, the landscape outside turned into a wall of black, impenetrable and silent. The bus became a capsule of light moving through a void. He was asleep, dreaming perhaps of the carnival lights or his mother's kitchen, blissfully unaware that the thread of his life was about to be severed. The wheels kept turning, bringing him closer not to Winnipeg, but to a nightmare that would freeze the blood of a nation. He slept the sleep of the innocent, unaware that the shadow was already moving, shifting, preparing to sit right beside him. Now, shift your gaze from the sleeping boy to the shadows where the other player in this tragedy was waiting. We must talk about the mind, my dears. The mind is a house with many rooms, and for most of us, the doors are locked tight, keeping the nightmares in the cellar. But for a man named Vince Lee, 40 years old and drifting like a leaf on a dark river, the doors had been blown off their hinges. He was a man you wouldn't look at twice. He was quiet, unassuming, a Chinese immigrant who had worked hard delivering newspapers, mopping floors, doing the work that makes a man invisible to the world. But while he was invisible to the passers-by, he was glaringly, blindingly visible to the demons that screamed inside his skull. Lee was not a man of malice, not originally. He was a man of sickness, a sickness that whispered, then spoke, then roared. He had been unraveling for a long time, the threads of reality fraying until they snapped. He didn't hear his own thoughts. He heard the voice of God. And God, in the twisted circuitry of Lee's deteriorating mind, was telling him that the world was not what it seemed. He believed he was being hunted. He believed the people around him were not people at all, but aliens, ancient evils wearing human skin like cheap suits. He was a soldier in a war that only he could see, a holy warrior trapped in a mundane hell of bus schedules and loneliness. Days before he stepped onto that metal beast, the pressure began to crush him. He was in Edmonton, restless, vibrating with a terrifying energy. He had bought a new laptop, a machine to connect him to the world, but the voices told him to sever the tie. He sold it to a bewildered teenager for $60, a fraction of its worth. Why? Because money means nothing when you are on a divine mission. He was shedding his earthly anchors. He was preparing. He packed a bag, not with clothes for a holiday, but with the tools of his perceived salvation. He packed a large, sharp hunting knife. It wasn't a weapon to him, it was a shield. It was the only thing that could stand between him and the monsters. He drifted to the Greyhound station, a purgatory of fluorescent lights and stale coffee smells. He sat there, his eyes darting, scanning the faces of strangers, looking for the telltale signs of the enemy. Can you imagine the terror of living in a world where a smile is a threat, where a glance is an act of war? He was terrified, sweating in the cool air, waiting for a sign. And then, the bus arrived. 1170. The numbers meant nothing, but the destination was inevitable. He boarded the bus with a heavy, robotic stiffness. He didn't move like a man who was tired. He moved like a machine programmed with a singular, grim code. He didn't go to the back immediately. No, he sat near the front at first. He sat upright, rigid, his bag clutched tight to his chest. He was a stone in a stream of flowing water. He watched the driver. He watched the road. He watched the darkness outside, convinced that the evil was closing in. The other passengers saw a quiet man staring at nothing. They didn't see the chaotic storm raging behind his eyes. They didn't hear the commands thundering in his ears, telling him to stay alert, to be ready, to identify the threat. He sat there for hours, a ticking bomb disguised as a weary traveler, waiting for the voice to tell him it was time to move. The bus rolled on, the engine humming its lullaby, while Vinsley sat in the silence of his own screaming mind, waiting for the moment the universe would demand blood. The bus slowed, the heavy air brakes hissing like a sigh of relief as the giant vehicle pulled into Brandon, Manitoba. It was a rest stop, a brief interlude in the long night where the passengers could stretch their stiff limbs, smoke a cigarette, and breathe in the cooling air. It was the mundane choreography of travel. People shuffled off, rubbing their faces, muttering quietly. Tim McLean, our sleeping boy, likely shifted but stayed in his warm cocoon, or perhaps he stepped out for a moment of fresh air before returning to his sanctuary in the back row. It was calm. It was ordinary. It was the last moment of normalcy the world would offer them. When the break was over, the passengers filed back on, a herd of weary cattle returning to the pen. But something had changed in the air, a subtle shift in the magnetic poles of the bus. Vinsley reboarded, but he didn't return to his seat near the front. The voices were louder now, insistent, pulling him like a marionette on invisible strings. He stood in the aisle, his dark eyes scanning the rows of heads. To anyone watching, he was just a man looking for a more comfortable spot, perhaps away from a draft or a noisy neighbor. But in his mind, he was a general surveying the battlefield, looking for the source of the danger. He began to walk down the narrow aisle. the floor vibrating beneath his feet. He passed the sleeping mothers, the reading students, the dozing workers. He moved toward the back, into the deeper shadows where the light from the driver's dashboard didn't reach. He stopped, at the very rear. There, curled against the window, headphones on, eyes closed, was Tim. To Lee, Tim was no longer a boy. The delusion had completely overlaid reality. He didn't see a carnival worker. He saw an agent of the darkness, an alien threat that had to be neutralized. Lee paused. He looked at the empty seat right next to Tim. The seat of destiny. He sat down. Tim, sensing the movement, stirred. He opened his eyes, groggy from sleep. He saw a stranger settling in beside him, invading that intimate bubble of personal space we try to maintain on public transit. And what did Tim do? He didn't recoil. He didn't scream. He did what any polite young man would do. He acknowledged the stranger. Maybe he gave a small, sleepy nod. Maybe he muttered a soft hello. He adjusted his legs to give Lee room, a final act of kindness. He put his headphones back on, turned his face to the window, and closed his eyes again, trusting that the man next to him was just another traveler. He went back to sleep, shoulder to shoulder with his executioner. The bus pulled out of Brandon, merging back onto the Trans-Canada Highway. The overhead lights flickered off, plunging the cabin into a cave-like gloom. The only illumination came from the small TV screens suspended from the ceiling. They began to play a movie, The Legend of Zorro. The flickering light of the film danced over the passengers' faces, casting long, twitching shadows. On the screen, swords clashed and heroes fought villains in choreographed duels. But in the back row, a real horror was uncoiling. The bus was quiet, save for the movie's muffled dialogue and the drone of the engine. Lee sat rigid, his hand moving slowly to his bag. His heart must have been hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with the terrible resolve of the insane. He waited for the rhythm of the road to steady, for the breathing of the bus to deepen. He sat in the dark, inches from Tim's warm, living neck, and listened to the command that would shatter. The silence forever. It was roughly 8:30 p.m. The sun had finally given up its ghost, leaving the world outside the windows in a deep, suffocating twilight. Inside, the air was cool, recycled, and smelled of faint coffee and weary bodies. The movie The Legend of Zorro flickered on the overhead screens, the sounds of sword fights and galloping horses masking the subtle noises of the road. Most people were drifting, suspended in that halfway place between wakefulness and dreams. Tim McLean was one of them. He was deep in sleep, his head resting against the window, the vibration of the glass against his temple a soothing rhythm. He was safe. He was warm. He was oblivious. Then the world shattered. It didn't happen with a shout or a warning. There was no argument, no rising tension that usually precedes violence. It was a detonation of silence. Vince Lee, the man sitting quietly beside him, the man who had seemed like just another shadow in the dark, suddenly stood up. In his hand, the darkness solidified into a large, gleaming hunting knife. It was a weapon made for skinning game, for slicing through muscle and gristle, and Lee wielded it with a terrifying, mechanical precision. He didn't hesitate. He didn't shake. He plunged the knife down into the sleeping boy's neck. Tim didn't even have time to scream. He woke up to the end of his life. His eyes surely flew open, wide with a confusion that must have been absolute, a sudden, searing pain that made no sense. He let out a sound, a heart-stopping, blood-curdling cry that wasn't quite a scream, but the sound of a soul being ripped from a body. It was a gurgle, a gasp, a desperate plea to a universe that had suddenly turned away. Garnet Cotton, a passenger sitting just one row ahead, heard the sound. It was a wet, sickening thud, followed by that terrible cry. He thought, for a fleeting second, that it was the movie, maybe a nightmare. He turned around, expecting to see someone laughing or maybe arguing. Instead, he saw a scene from hell itself. He saw Lee standing over Tim, his arm rising and falling like a piston. The knife flashed in the pale light of the TV screens. Up, down, up, down. There was no anger on Lee's face, no rage. He looked like a robot, his eyes wide behind his sunglasses, his mouth set in a grim line. He was working. That is what the witnesses said later. He looked like a man diligently performing a task, oblivious to the fact that he was butchering a human being. "He's got a knife," someone screamed. The spell of the sleepy bus ride broke instantly. Panic is a contagion, my dears, and it spreads faster than fire. People scrambled out of their seats. The air filled with the scent of copper, fresh, hot blood. It sprayed across the windows, across the seats, across the terrified faces of those nearby. Tim was fighting, instinctively, his hands coming up to defend himself, but he was trapped. He was pinned against the window by the seat in front and the man beside him. There was nowhere to go. The attack was frenzied, relentless. Lee was stabbing him in the chest, the neck, the eyes. He was obliterating him. The passengers in the back surged forward, a wave of human terror crashing toward the front of the bus. "Stop the bus! Stop the bus!" they screamed at the driver. The driver, confused, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, saw the commotion. He saw the blood. He saw the flash of the blade. The bus swerved slightly as he slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest against the asphalt. The momentum threw people forward, tangling limbs and luggage, but no one cared. All that mattered was getting away from the monster in the back row. In those few seconds, seconds that must have felt like hours to Tim, the bus transformed from a sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. The movie Zorro played on, a cruel mockery of heroism, while in the dim light of the back seat, a young man was being erased from existence by a stranger who believed he was killing a demon. The sound of the knife hitting bone, the wet tearing of flesh, the screams of the passengers. It was a cacophony of madness that drowned out the hum of the engine. And through it all, Lee kept stabbing, staring intently at his work, deaf to the screams, locked in his own private, holy war. The bus lurched, the tires screaming against the asphalt as the driver, Bruce Martin, fought the wheel. He pulled the massive vehicle onto the gravel shoulder of the Trans-Canada Highway, about 30 kilometers west of Portage-la Prairie. The sudden stop threw the standing passengers off balance, sending them tumbling into the aisle, a tangle of limbs and terror. The doors hissed open, and the bus seemed to vomit its contents into the night. People didn't walk, they scrambled. They fell out of the door, crawling on hands and knees, gasping for air that didn't smell of copper and death. They ran into the ditch, into the tall grass, their eyes wide and white in the moonlight, looking back at the silver bus that sat idling like a tomb. But not everyone ran. There are those among us who, when the fire starts, run toward the heat. Chris Alguire, a truck driver who had been dozing in a nearby seat, didn't flee into the dark. He stood his ground. He saw the blood. He saw the madness. He grabbed a pry bar, a heavy, iron tool, and along with the driver, he moved back toward the open door. They weren't soldiers. They weren't police. They were just men, propelled by a desperate, frantic need to stop the slaughter. They peered back into the cavern of the bus, hoping against hope that they could pull Tim out, that there was something, anything, left to save. What they saw froze the marrow in their bones. Vinsley was no longer just stabbing. The frenzy had shifted into something far more grotesque. He had severed Tim's head. He was holding it, blood slicking his hands, his face a mask of blank, terrifying purpose. He looked up and saw Alguire and Martin at the door. He didn't cower. He didn't look guilty. He charged. With the severed head in one hand and the knife in the other, Lee lunged toward the front of the bus. He was silent, swift, a demon unleashed. Alguire and Martin scrambled back, their boots slipping on the gravel. They slammed the door shut just as Lee reached the front stairs. He slashed at the glass, the knife screeching against the barrier. He held up the head for them to see, pressing it against the window, a gruesome trophy displayed for the terrified audience outside. He was taunting them, or perhaps showing them his victory over the alien. The driver, thinking fast, disabled the bus. He cut the engine, killing the lights and the power, ensuring that this monster couldn't hijack the vehicle and take his horror down the road to another town. But the door was the only thing keeping him in. Alguire stood there, his knuckles white on the pry bar, guarding the door. He became the gatekeeper of hell. He wedged himself against it, ensuring Lee couldn't force it open. Inside, the bus was now a cage. Lee, realizing he was trapped, didn't panic. He simply turned his back on the men outside. He walked back to the rear of the bus, back to what was left of Tim McLean. The passengers, huddled in the ditch, crying and shaking, could only watch the shadows moving inside. They saw Lee pacing. They saw him bending down. They saw him eating. The realization rippled through the group like a shockwave. He wasn't just killing him. He was consuming him. The horror was so absolute, so beyond the pale of human understanding, that some of the witnesses couldn't process it. They threw up. They wailed. They clung to each other in the dark, the highway stretching out endlessly in both directions, empty and indifferent. They were stranded on the side of the road with a cannibal locked inside a bus, and the only thing separating them from the beast was a pane of glass and the courage of a trucker with a crowbar. The silence of the prairie night was broken only by the sound of weeping, and the distant, wet sounds coming from inside the metal shell. The door was shut, the air brakes hissed into silence, and the bus sat on the shoulder of the Trans-Canada Highway like a great, silver beast that had just swallowed something poisonous. The passengers, now a huddled mass of shivering, sobbing humanity, stood in the tall grass of the ditch, staring back at the vehicle. They were stranded in the vast, empty darkness of the Manitoba prairie, the only light coming from the faint glow of the bus interior and the headlights of passing cars that slowed, the drivers peering curiously at the scene before speeding away, oblivious to the hell that had just opened up on the roadside. Inside that metal cage, Vinsley was alone with his victim, and he was not finished. To the horror of those watching through the windows, Lee did not cower in the back. He didn't hide. He began to pace the aisle, a dark silhouette against the dim lights. He moved with a strange, calm energy, like a man tidying up his living room. But he wasn't cleaning. He was desecrating. He went back to the seat where Tim's body lay, a broken doll in a pool of red. He bent down, and for a moment, he disappeared from view. The witnesses held their breath, praying he was checking for a pulse, praying for a miracle. But when he stood up, hope died forever. In his hand, gripped by the hair, was the severed head of Tim McLean. He didn't hide it. He walked to the front of the bus, to the very door where the truck driver stood guard with his pry bar. He pressed the face against the glass. He held it up like a trophy, a gruesome offering to the night. His face was blank, void of any human emotion, his eyes hidden behind those dark sunglasses. He looked at the terrified faces outside, the mothers clutching their children, the students shaking in shock, and he displayed his work with a chilling, robotic pride. He was showing them the alien he had destroyed. He was showing them that the threat was neutralized. Then, he turned back. He walked down the aisle again, the head swinging slightly in his grip. He returned to the body. And that is when the true, retching horror set in. He didn't just kill. He didn't just behead. He began to cut pieces of flesh from the body. He raised them to his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. The people outside screamed. Some vomited into the ditch. The reality of it was too big, too grotesque to fit into their minds. A man was eating another man, right there, behind a pane of glass, on a public bus, on a Wednesday night. It was the stuff of ancient nightmares, of ogres and monsters from the old world, brought to life on a modern highway. They were witnessing a primal taboo being shattered, a violation of the most basic law of nature. The isolation was absolute. There were no sirens yet, no flashing lights, just the vast, indifferent sky, the hum of the distant traffic, and the wet, rhythmic sounds coming from inside the bus. Lee moved back and forth, severing ears, nose, tongue. He pocketed them like souvenirs. He was building a collection. He was completely detached from the reality of the police who would soon arrive, from the laws of man, from the sanctity of life. He was alone in his delusion, a king in a kingdom of blood, while the subjects of his terror stood shivering in the cold, praying for the flashing lights that would signal the end of the world. The cavalry did not arrive with trumpets, my dears. They arrived in a wash of red and blue light that stained the prairie grass and made the silver skin of the bus pulse with a frantic, strobe-like energy. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, pulled up, sirens wailing, shattering the silence that had settled over the horrified witnesses. For a moment, there was a collective exhale, a desperate hope that the men in uniform would rush the bus, kick down the door, and end the nightmare. But reality is rarely an action movie. When the officers approached the vehicle, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Into the night, they were met not with surrender, but with a scene that would haunt their sleep until their dying days. Vinsley was still inside. He hadn't fled. He hadn't tried to hide in the cargo hold. He was pacing the aisle like a tiger in a zoo cage, back and forth, back and forth. But unlike a tiger, he was carrying the remains of Tim McLean. The standoff began. It wasn't a negotiation. There was no one to negotiate with. Lee was deaf to their bullhorns, deaf to their pleas to drop the weapon. He was locked in a dialogue with voices only he could hear. To the police, he was a monster defiling a corpse. To Lee, he was a sentinel standing guard over a defeated enemy. He believed, in his shattered reality, that the alien he had killed could come back to life. He had to be sure. He had to dismantle it. He had to consume its power. So, while heavily armed officers trained their rifles on the windows, finger hovering over triggers, Lee continued his gruesome work. He would walk up to the front door, the glass separating him from the tactical team by mere feet. He would look at them, his face impassive, and he would hold up the severed head. He would wave it, almost tauntingly, or perhaps presenting it as proof of his deed. He cut off the nose. He cut off the ear. He put them in his pocket. Then he would return to the back, to the body, and eat. The police were paralyzed. Breaching the bus was a tactical nightmare. The aisle was narrow, a fatal funnel where a man with a knife could ambush the first officer through the door. And for what? The victim was already gone. There was no life to save, only a body to recover. So they waited. They set up a perimeter, a ring of steel and light around the bus. They brought in negotiators who tried to pierce the veil of Lee's madness, calling out to him, asking him to come out. But Lee only stared, or paced, or ate. Hours ticked by. The night deepened. The witnesses were shuttled away to a nearby hotel, their clothes stained with blood. That wasn't theirs, their minds reeling. But the police remained. They watched through the windows as Lee moved with that terrifying, jerky energy. They saw him decapitate the body completely. They saw him sever the arms and legs. He was dismantling Tim McLean piece by piece, stripping him of his humanity, reducing a young man to a pile of biological matter. At one point, Lee approached the door with the knife in one hand and the head in the other. He slashed at the air, mimicking a stabbing motion toward the officers. He seemed to be saying, "I am ready for you too." The psychological toll on the officers was immense. They were trained to stop bad guys, to save lives. They weren't trained to watch a cannibal feast on a boy inside a locked bus on the Trans-Canada Highway. They stood their ground, shivering in the cool night air, weapons raised, helpless to stop the desecration, waiting for the sun to rise or for the monster to tire. The standoff stretched on, a gruesome tableau frozen in time, while the radio crackled with updates that sounded more like horror fiction than police procedure. The darkness of the prairie night began to thin, giving way to the gray, ghostly light of early dawn. The standoff had lasted for hours, a grueling endurance test for the officers who stood watch, their nerves frayed, their eyes burning from staring at the macabre silhouette pacing inside the bus. Inside that metal tube, the energy had shifted. Vince Lee, the man who had spent the night dismantling a human being with the precision of a butcher and the fervor of a zealot, was finally looking for an exit. The alien was destroyed. The mission, in his fractured mind, was complete. But the vessel, the bus, had become a trap. Around 1:30 a.m., the silence was shattered not by a scream, but by the sound of glass exploding. Lee, desperate now, hurled himself at a window near the back of the bus. He smashed through the emergency exit, the safety glass raining down like diamonds onto the asphalt. He didn't climb out tentatively. He leaped. He threw his bag out first, then tumbled after it, landing hard on the ground. But the police were waiting. The moment his feet touched the earth, the perimeter collapsed inward. The tactical team, coiled like springs for hours, unleashed their energy. There was a shout, a command, and then the sharp crack of a taser. The electrified barbs hit Lee, seizing his muscles, locking his limbs in a rigid spasm of pain. He dropped to the ground, twitching, the fight draining out of him as the voltage coursed through his system. Officers swarmed him, a sea of black uniforms pinning him to the cold pavement. He was handcuffed, his arms wrenched behind his back, his face pressed into the gravel. They dragged him up, a small, unassuming man in blood-soaked clothes. He didn't roar. He didn't fight like a demon anymore. He was just a man again, small and confused, surrounded by giants with guns. But the true horror was yet to be revealed. As they patted him down, searching for weapons, their hands brushed against his pockets. They weren't empty. Inside his pants pockets, they found plastic bags. And inside those bags were the trophies of his kill. A nose, a tongue, an ear. He had harvested them like crops. And then, the grim inventory continued. They looked at his face, at his mouth, and realized the unthinkable. The eyes. Tim McLean's eyes were nowhere to be found. They weren't in the bags. They weren't on the bus. They were gone. Consumed. Lee stood there, the taste of his victim still on his tongue, the pieces of a young man in his pocket. He looked at the officers, his expression shifting from the blank mask of the killer to something resembling human despair. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for mercy. He looked at the men who had captured him, and he whispered 3 chilling words that would echo in the courtroom later. "Please kill me." It wasn't a taunt. It was a plea. In that moment, perhaps the fog of his psychosis lifted just enough for him to see the abyss he had fallen into. Or perhaps he simply wanted to join the alien he had vanquished. He was loaded into a cruiser, a broken vessel of madness, leaving behind a bus that was now a crime scene so horrific that even the seasoned investigators would need therapy to process what they found inside. The sun rose over the Trans-Canada Highway, illuminating the shattered glass, the blood on the road, and the empty shell of Greyhound 1170, where a young man's journey home had ended in the jaws of a nightmare. The courtroom was not a place of shouting or drama, but of a heavy, suffocating silence. It was here, under the sterile fluorescent lights of the Manitoba justice system, that the world tried to make sense of the senseless. Vince Lee sat in the dock, no longer the blood-soaked monster of the highway, but a small, quiet man in a prison jumpsuit, looking bewildered and broken. He didn't deny what he had done. There was no "it wasn't me." The facts were laid out in gruesome, clinical detail. The knife, the decapitation, the cannibalism. The Crown and the defense agreed on the act. But the question that hung in the air, thick as smoke, was why? This is where we must peer into the abyss of the human mind, my dears. The trial wasn't about finding a killer. Everyone knew who held the knife. It was about finding the man behind the killer. And what the psychiatrist found was a tragedy of biology and neglect. Vince Lee was not evil in the biblical sense. He was sick. Profoundly, devastatingly sick. He had been suffering from untreated schizophrenia for years. The voice of God, he told the court, had been speaking to him. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a conscience. It was a booming, commanding audio hallucination that drowned out reality. On that bus, God had told him that Tim McLean was a force of darkness, a threat, an alien. Can you imagine living in a reality where the person sleeping next to you is a monster about to kill you? Lee believed. He was acting in self-defense. He believed he was a soldier on a divine mission to save the other passengers. He didn't see a 22-year-old carnival worker. He saw a terrifying entity that had to be destroyed to save the world. The cannibalism? It wasn't hunger. It was a ritual, a way to ensure the alien could not regenerate, could not come back to life to hurt anyone else. He had to consume the threat to neutralize it completely. The judge, Justice John Schofield, looked at the evidence. He looked at the weeping family of Tim McLean, their hearts torn open by the details read aloud in court. The missing eyes, the ears in the pocket. He looked at Lee, who sat with his head bowed, whispering, "I'm sorry," to a room that couldn't hear him. And then, the verdict came down. It was a phrase that ignited a firestorm of public fury, a phrase that feels like a betrayal to those who demand an eye for an eye, not criminally responsible. NCR. It didn't mean he was innocent. It meant his mind was so broken, so detached from reality at the moment of the crime, that he could not form the intent to murder. He was a passenger in his own body, driven by a disease. The law, in its cold logic, said you cannot punish a man for a crime his brain committed while he was absent. The public screamed, "How can a man behead someone and not be guilty?" They cried. "He ate him. He deserves to die." But the gavel fell. Vinsley was not sent to a maximum security prison to rot. He was remanded to the Selkirk Mental Health Center, a high-security hospital. He was locked away not as a convict, but as a patient. The doors clanged shut, not on a cell, but on a ward. And as Lee was led away, medicated and finally quiet, the family of Tim McLean was left with a verdict that felt like a ghost. Justice had been served according to the book, but it felt hollow, empty, and terrifyingly fragile. The gavel fell, the doors of the asylum closed, and the cameras turned away to find the next tragedy. But for those left, standing in the wreckage of July 30th, 2008, the horror did not end with a verdict. It began a new, agonizing chapter of silence and shadows. Tim McLean is gone. His laughter, his future, the children he might have had, all stolen in a frenzy of madness on a lonely stretch of highway. But his mother, Carol Dedeli, refused to let him become just a footnote in a medical journal. She became a warrior, a mother lioness roaring into a void that refused to answer back. She looked at the law that declared a man who beheaded and cannibalized her son not criminally responsible, and she wept not just tears of grief, but of fury. She fought for Tim's law, begging the government to keep killers like Lee locked away forever, regardless of their mental state. "He ate my son," she would say, her voice trembling with a pain that no parent should ever know. "How can you say he is safe? How can you promise he won't stop taking his pills?" Her fight was a desperate clawing against a system that prioritized rehabilitation over retribution, a system that said a sick man deserves a cure, even if the cost was her son's life. And what of the others? The passengers who sat in that metal tube while hell broke loose? They didn't just walk away. They carried the nightmare with them. Garnet Cotton, the man who sat one row up, the man who saw the first strike, was haunted by the sounds of that night. Chris Alguire, the trucker who held the door with a pry bar, stood guard against a monster, but he couldn't protect his own mind from the memories. They suffered from PTSD, from depression, from the terrifying realization that the world is not safe. They saw things that the human mind is not built to process, images that surely visit them in the dead of night when the house is quiet and the wind howls outside. But the story has one final, chilling twist. Vinsley did not rot in a cell. He was treated. He took his medication. The voices stopped. The aliens vanished. And slowly, quietly, the system began to loosen its grip. First, he was allowed walks on the hospital grounds. Then, supervised trips into the city of Selkirk. Then, unsupervised visits. And finally, in 2017, less than a decade after he butchered a young man on a Greyhound bus, he was granted an absolute discharge. He is a free man today. He changed his name to Will Baker. He lives among us, perhaps in your city, perhaps in your neighborhood. He has no criminal record. In the eyes of the law, he is not a murderer. He is a patient who recovered. He is free to take a bus. He is free to sit next to a stranger. He is free to close his eyes and listen to music. The doctors say he is a model patient, a low risk to reoffend as long as he takes his medication. But that as long as hangs in the air like a guillotine blade. We trust him to swallow a pill every day. We trust the chemistry of his brain to hold the demons at bay. And we trust that the voice of God will never again command him to pick up a knife. So, the next time you board a bus, my dears, look around you. Look at the sleeping student, the tired mother, the quiet man in sunglasses sitting in the back row. We are all just travelers, hurtling through the dark in a metal box, putting our lives in the hands of strangers. We assume everyone is fighting the same mundane battles we are. But sometimes, the person next to you is fighting a war you cannot see. Sometimes, the person next to you is waiting for a signal. And sometimes, the only thing separating you from a nightmare is a skipped dose of medication and the whim of a shattered mind. Sleep tight, travelers. And maybe, just maybe, keep one eye open.